Chapter 21, Guam. While the Marines of the 2nd and 4th Division were taking Saipan, our 3rd Marine Division boarding our own ships and set sail, ready to hit the beaches, the landing of Guam was set for June 18th. But it didn't happen. At the last minute, Admiral Spruance decided to send the 27th Army Division, the soldiers who were supposed to be our backups, to help take Saipan. The 3rd Division was ordered to hold their position. The unit I was in was sent back to the little island of Wanjalin and Inuwetok to the east of Guam. It was hard being told just to wait on those little islands without knowing what was going to happen or when. "There ain't nothing here to do but count legs," Georgia Boy said as we sat in our barracks watching the land crabs scuttling up and down the coconut trees. "Those big crabs make me nervous about going out at night. They look like gigantic spiders, as well as common on Etowalk as ground squirrels are back home. If I ever stepped on one in my bare feet, I was sure it would chop my toes off with those big pincers." I was teased about being more scared of crabs than enemy soldiers, but no amount of teasing could get me to set foot on the barracks after dark, when every place outside was crawling with crabs and you could hear them rustling and clicking through the palm leaves. All there was to do on those islands was drill and swim, play cards and eat fish, complain and sleep. But we were better off board on shore than stuck on board like the other Marine units. They were kept cooped up on the hot, crowded transport ships out at sea, stuck there for almost 2 months, just waiting. Another strange thing about war, grandchildren, is that when things do not go as planned, they may turn out better. So it was in our invasion of Guam. Our landing was delayed, but not the Navy bombardment. Instead of only 1 day, they now had almost 2 weeks to work over the coast of Guam. They were led by Admiral Connolly. Everyone knew him as Close-Up Connolly, as he really lived up to that nickname. Admiral Connolly had learned from the mistakes at Bougainville and Tarawa, where the naval shelling had been too brief or too inaccurate to break down Japanese defenses. Close-Up Connolly brought these 3 cruiser divisions and 6 battleships in right next to the shore to pound the coastal defenses. For 13 days, the battleships boomed and heavy shells rained down on target. By the time Admiral Connolly was done, the Japanese beach defense was pulverized. Airstrikes had also wiped out all of Japanese planes on Guam that might have attacked our invading forces. Finally, we were loaded back on ship and off shores of Guam. It meant a lot for us to take Guam. Guam was U.S. territory. Before the Japanese attacks, it had been an American island. I had read some about it in my geography book in Navajo High School and was reading more about it now. That was one thing I did before every invasion. I'd scrap up whatever reading matter there was on the boarding ship about the place we were going. "Begay, here is our travel agent," our lieutenant wisecracked. "He's checking out all the best hotels for us to stay in." Even though they kidded me, the other guys asked me what I'd learned about Guam, and I told them. Its people had been American citizens since the Spanish-American War. They were called Chamaros. A U.S. naval base, a deep-water harbor, and a marine airfield had all been taken over by the Japanese when they invaded Guam on December 8, 1941. The day after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Chamaros had stayed local to us after the Japanese came, and they tried to resist. As a result, the Japanese had been cruel to them. If the Chamaros refused to work for the Japanese, they were shot or put into concentration camps on the island. You know, grandchildren, for a long time, even after the war, it was hard for me to have any good thoughts about the Japanese. What troubled me the most was the way they treated the native people of the islands they were conquered. They believed only Japanese were real humans. Anyone else could be treated like a dog. Never forget, grandchildren, that we must always see all other people as human beings worthy of respect. We must never forget, as the Japanese forgot, that all life is holy. "Tuman Bay," Major General Turnage said to his officers as he stood on the bridge. With a wave of his hand, he indicated the wide 2.5-mile sweep of beach that was now in view. Although I was assigned to a landing party, I was up there on the bridge checking signals with the other members of our code team who'd been staying on board to send and receive messages. Because of our special role, we code talkers were able to go to places where ordinary Marines hardly ever set foot. "Best landing place on the island," Major General Turnage said, nodding his head. "No reef to cross, nice level sand, darn fine landing place. Just where the enemy expect us." Then he smiled. "Sorry to disappoint them." Instead of Tumen Bay, we went further south. There we would have to cross the reef to land on 2 western beaches that lay below the sheer bluffs. July 21st was set for the invasion, W Day, as our leaders named it. As the first light outlined the island, I stood by rail watching. I'd managed to find a wooden box to stand on, so I wasn't just looking at the backs of the Marines as sometimes happened. "Hey, little fella, want me to boost you up on my shoulder?" a familiar voice said from behind me. It was Smitty, of course. He sometimes kidded me about being so short, but I always had an easy answer. Bigger guys make bigger targets. The next thing I knew, I was in the alligator rumbling over the reef. I could hear the roar of the LVT's engines, the whop 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 of small waves hitting the metal side of the boat, and the coral being crushed by the treads, sort of like the sound sugar cubes make when they are crushed between teeth. But I don't even remember hearing the whistle and the order to land the landing party. Once again, I had the familiar, unsettling feeling of being in a movie where the film has been broken and then spliced together a whole scene later. All of a sudden, sand was churning under my feet as I sprinted across the beach. It was easier for me to run because all of us code talkers had the new lighter portable radio units. But it was not just because the new unit on my back was lighter that I ran so much faster. I had no longer had 40 pounds of TBX radio to hide behind, and I needed to get cover as fast as I could. Our first wave of alligators had crawled up on Red Beach just below Assam Point. The beach was small, only 200 yards long, but the bluffs made up for it. They looked like they were 10 miles high. "You got any high hills like that back home, Chief?" Smitty yelled. We had taken shelter in the shell crater from the American bombardment. We'd been met with small arms and machine gun fire, but no enemy bombs or shells were falling among us. I peered up toward the bluff, where he was pointing with his chin. In the time we'd been together, he'd learned the Navajo way of pointing with your lips or your chin rather than your hands. That hill rose up steeper than I would have liked. Not really 10 miles, but at least 200 feet. We had to climb it, even though the Japanese were firing down at us from the heights. I looked back toward the shore where the tanks were being unloaded. "As long as we don't have to carry one of those, I think we can do it," I said. Then we went running across the beach, dodging back and forth so that we would not be a good target for the small arm fire coming from above. All the way up that cliff, bullets kept spraying the sand in our face and bouncing off the rocks around us. Somehow, neither one of us got hit. But when we got to the top, the fire was so intense that all we could do was dig in along the rest of the men in our first wave. I got on my radio and began standing. We were going to have to fight for every inch of ground. It was not easy for us to break out from our beach ahead. There were over 18,000 Japanese troops on the Guam. They'd mostly been deployed at Tumen Bay, but when the commanders finally realized we weren't going near there, they moved them to head us off and keep us boxed in. We code talkers were kept busy, sending messages after messages from the shore to the command ship. Our headquarters had been set up now in our shore, and I was told not just to report to the command post, but to set myself up a cot there, housed in the same tent as General Howling Mad Smith. Before long, Admiral Nimitz and his generals were meeting in the tent to discuss battle plans, while we Navajo code talkers waited in the corner right there next to the top brass. I was only in that tent for a little while, but it made me feel extra safe being guarded right along with the general. Eventually, though, I was assigned to a unit moving inland. We began to walk our way into the island. It was a slow walk, only a few miles at a time, and we took back the coastal town of Asan, Agana, and pushed through the rice paddies to secure the important road junctions. Every town that we had been destroyed by the enemy as they retreated. It made me sad to walk through those broken towns. No living people were to be seen, but there were many bodies of native people who had been slaughtered by the angry Japanese as they pulled back. Finally, on July 25th, there was a lull in the action and our units were able to regroup. Finally, Smitty said, we can get some rest. I don't think so, I said, hoping I was wrong. But I wasn't. The pause in the fighting did not last. Japanese soldiers had been taught that there was only one thing to do when they were hopeless, when they were surrounded, or when their leaders were killed. Attack. We Marines had always began our battles at dawn. The Japanese, though, like the monster being in our old stories, preferred to strike in the darkness. The night when the first attacks came, some of the men in our groups were trying to sleep, but I was not. I just sat staring out in the dark, waiting as the slow hours ticked away. 2,100 hours. 2,100 hours. Then, just after midnight, it seemed as if the air grew thick and trembled. "They are coming!" I said, surprised at how calm my voice was. A single scream, so loud and distorted that it didn't seem to come from a human throat, tore the night. Shapes began hurtling at us on the darkness amidst the flashing and crashing of weapons and the smell of gunpowder. We were dug in. Many of those attackers were killed by our machine guns, but others fought their way through. A different place in our line, there was hand-to-hand fighting. Each time a wave of attackers was wiped out, another human came screaming in. I cannot recall what I did during those hours of darkness, grandchildren. I am glad that my mind does not allow me to remember. By the time the sun rose the next day, the attacks had ended. Our line had not been broken. 3,500 enemy soldiers had died, including many of their high officers. We had not suffered many casualties, but one of them was Johnson Housewood, another of our Navajo code talkers. He'd been with the 21st Marines, dug in a small hill just 100 yards past my own foxhole. As he raised his head, a bullet had struck him. He was the third code talker to die. On July 27th, we broke from our beachheads and began to take back the rest of Guam. On August 10th, we reached the sea at the north end of the island. There would still be weeks of skirmishing ahead with a small group of enemies still in the hills and jungle, but the battle for Guam was won. As I walked along, the sun was shining, and I could feel a light of that sunshine beginning to warm my heart. We trudged down into Agana, the capital city of Guam. There we set up command posts and a hospital. Little groups of Chamorros who managed to escape the Japanese began to come back into Agana. They needed help, but we were more eager to help us by telling where the remaining Japanese were hiding. Because Guam had been an American island for so long, the Chamorros spoke English as well as we did. It was heartbreaking for me to hear their stories and to see the little children whose families were dead. What happened to those Chamorros and the people on the other islands made me think yet again of what had been done to our Navajo people during the time of the long walk. I wanted to weep for them. It was just as bad for the Chamorros as it had been for us Indians. In fact, grandchildren, I think it was worse for the Chamorros. At least we could run to the hills. The people of those little islands had nowhere to get away. Guam was only 30 miles long and 7 miles wide. Have you ever had a dream where you see a monster but cannot move your feet to run away? That is how it was for the Chamorros when the Japanese soldiers came. I tried to do as much as I could, helping them carry their few possessions and sharing my food. Before long, all of the Navajos were bringing the natives right into our chow lines, and no one ever objected. There was one little boy that I will never forget. He was only 7 years old, and his name was Johnny. His whole family had been killed when the Japanese invaded. Our Navajo way is that no child should ever be without a family. So Wilsey Bitsy brought him into our tent, and we gave him a cot to sleep on. He stayed there while we were on patrol, and he was always waiting for us when we came back, a big smile on his face. He made up a sad little song about what happened to him. On the 8th day of December, the Father above took my father and took my mother. He took my sisters and he took my brothers. He took baby Jer, who was only a month old. He took them all. He left me by myself, and I had no one to turn to. We took care of little Johnny all the time we were on Guam. When we finally got our orders to pull out, leaving him was like losing a member of our family. Wilsey picked little Johnny up, carried him to the Red Cross aid station. They promised they would make sure that he was placed with a good family. The last thing Wilsey did was give Johnny his address back home so that they could always stay in touch by writing to each other. There's one more story to tell you about Guam, grandchildren. It started out very sad. In those last days of fighting, after the Japanese pulled back from the Tian airfields on August 7th, our patrols pushed their way through the jungle, pursuing them. Charlie Begay, another of our code talkers, was with a forward patrol that walked into an ambush and was cut to pieces. A few hours later, our unit, which included Wilsey and me, discovered that was left out of patrol. Wilsey found Charlie's body. As he knelt to look at him, I had a hopeless feeling in the pit of my stomach. Charlie's lips were blue, and there was no sign of breath. An awful wound, probably from a sword, went from his right shoulder across his neck and chest. Graves' registration hasn't been through yet, Wilsey said. I could see how upset he was. Charlie had been one of Wilsey's best friends back home. Wilsey took one of Charlie's dog tags and put it into his own pocket. He straightened his friend's body, placed the other dog tag in Charlie's mouth, and tied his mouth shut with a strip of cloth. There was a standard procedure to make sure a dead man's identification would not get lost. Then we placed Charlie's body near a log, covered him with leaves and bark, and said a prayer. Later that day, we gave Charlie's dog tag to the CO, who had packed his belongings, wrote a letter to his family, and sent it all the way home. So when Wilsey left Guam, he was not just leaving behind little Johnny, but also one of his best friends he'd ever had. We all kept thinking about Charlie's death. Weeks later, though, back on the canal, several of us code talkers were sitting around with a jeep pulled up to our tent. I had just gotten back from our little vacation and was being filled in by the guys about what was new. Leslie, Cody, and I were by the door, and Wilsey was on his cot by the tent flap. We all figured they were bringing another Navajo to the Charlie Begay's replacement. I walked up to greet him. But when that person who got out of the jeep turned around, I became speechless. All I could do was stand and stare in shocked silence. Have you been to the lands of devils? Leslie Cody said, in a hushed voice in Navajo, as that person, who now had a little smile on his face, stepped past me in the tent. Like me, Leslie was so shocked he couldn't move. Wilsey, though, jumped up and ran over to the man. It was Charlie Begay, dressed in clean new khakis. Yatai, Charlie said, his smile getting even broader. What happened? Wilsey stammered. Last time I saw you, you were dead. Charlie Begay shook his head and looked down at the ground. I don't remember much of anything after the Japanese ambushed us, except I started to feel my feet twitch. Then I heard my heart beat. It seemed that somebody, he said, looking up at Wilsey, had put bark and leaves all over me, so I started moving to shake that stuff off. Then I rolled over. I realized some helpful person had stuck my dog tag in my mouth. I was not pleased about that. I was just trying to stand up when Graves' registration got to me. Charlie had been evacuated to the hospital ship. He had lost a lot of blood and a big scar, but eventually was recovered enough to report back to duty. We were all overjoyed that day when Charlie came back to life, and Wilsey was the happiest of us all.